Good morning, everyone. It's time for our travels screen here, and we're just going to get started. So, welcome. Um, I'm hoping that you're excited to learn about natural travel secrets today. I myself have done a lot of traveling around the world and sent lots of people, lots of patients around the world into various locations and had some great success with natural remedies. And so we're going to go through those today, just like we promised on the introductory webinar. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to talk about is sick people on the plane. People travel when ill all the time. Crowded conditions, stressful environments really don't help. And if you tend to get sick easily, you could consider doing a really easy preventative treatment, and that is just alternate 500 milligrams of vitamin C in a capsule of freeze-dried garlic per hour while on the plane. Um, Vitamin C is very immunostimulatory, and freeze-dried garlic has very nice broad-spectrum antibiotic, antiviral effect that's really defends that mucous membrane really well. And so if you do, especially if you're traveling in winter, and lots of people will travel with colds and things like that, if you're on a long flight, this can really help a lot. Dosages could be weight adjusted for kids. And the real reason behind that, adjusting the dosage, is not that vitamin C or garlic is harmful and too big of a dose, but that if a child eats too much vitamin C, they could potentially get diarrhea. Adults too, but you might just want to go about half that for a little kid for vitamin C. The other thing is that water really counts. If you're on a plane, there's a lot of dehydration that happens because planes are quite dry and they're recycling the air all the time. And so you really want to create a good mucous membrane defense by being well hydrated. So usually what I recommend is that people use slightly salted fluids. So water with a pinch of, usually sea salt is what we use. I travel with just like a little pouch of sea salt. And just throw that into the water. And then if you don't like the taste of that, it's just very, very mildly salty, then you can always add a splash of juice on top of that. But make sure that you're drinking lots of water. Obviously, you might also have to go to the bathroom on the plane, which is always not the most fun thing. But better that than feeling like you're getting too dry and too susceptible to germs there. Now, if you're afraid of flying and you really don't like getting on the plane because you're a bit afraid of being in a tube flying over the earth, people do get mental emotional stress and anxiety from airplane travel. And that can really be combated with some pretty simple remedies. I have a couple of these listed here. So Rescue Remedy. Rescue Remedy is a batch flower remedy. They come in very, very small bottles, so you can easily take it on the plane. And it can be found in most health food stores. It really helps with mild travel stress and anxiety. It's not only used for travel stress, it's basically going to be used, anytime you're in a stressful situation, or, if you get in a car accident or something like that, you can always take Rescue Remedy. But it can easily be taken as often as needed to calm you down. And it's totally safe for small kids. And it's also safe for animals if you're taking them in a plane situation. And it's also safe to combine with other medications. There's not going to be any interactions with Rescue Remedy. Now, the next thing I have written here is Gelsemium. Gelsemium is a homeopathic for anticipatory anxiety. If you're anxious just thinking about flying, you can use this remedy in advance of flying and on the plane as needed. So to use a 30C homeopathic, so 30C is a common potency of homeopathic that you can find in the health food store. All you need to do is melt 3 pellets under your tongue as needed. So that could be up to every 15 minutes if you have that feeling of kind of dread. And this remedy can actually be taken in advance. So make sure that, like if you do feel like that's the case, if you do it in advance, you will get a better effect. Now, if your anxiety is a little stronger, I would consider using Neuropass. So Neuropass is a herbal combination of valerian, passion flower, and St. John's wort. This is a remedy you'll have to check with your ND if you have other medications because it can interfere with some. But it is a very good anxiolytic. Really does calm people down, and it works quite quickly. You don't usually need a big window for this. You don't necessarily need to start this ahead of time. It'll typically work within about a half an hour to just calm things down. And last but not least, an easy thing to do is to have Compro. So Compro is our chewable theanine supplement. Now you can get it in different brands, but this one is chewable, so they're quite handy. You can stick a handful of them in your pocket, and if you chew one, what theanine really does is it quickly calms you down by increasing GABA. And GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and that can completely sort out panic, and it's quite convenient to have them. It's also safe to do in younger kids, and it's not going to interfere with any medications if you were taking some other anxiolytic. Now, another major problem for travelers on the plane is foot swelling. Lots of people find their feet swell on the plane. And this is actually usually due to two major problems. The first is that you already have poor circulation. And the second is that you're pretty dehydrated, which if it's the latter, you're really going to want to fix that prior to getting on the plane. But it takes about 4 weeks. And if you don't have 4 weeks to do that, here's some other ways of getting around this. First of all, keep moving. Make sure you get up or at least roll your ankles and move your legs on the plane. Your venous circulation, so that's the circulation that returns the blood from the extremities, depends on your muscles contracting. That helps push the blood back up out of the legs. And so movement, a lot of the time people will sit on the plane and not really move around, and that actually compounds the problem quite a bit. So just make sure that you do some standard ankle movements. Do it every 15 minutes. And just make sure you're stretching them out and moving around. And if you have a chance to walk a little bit on the plane, that's great. Sometimes the conditions don't really allow for that, but make sure you're moving in your seat. Second thing that you can do, which is fairly easy, is to use some compression stockings. If you already have prescription compression stockings, this is a good time to wear them as is on the plane. So with compression stockings, you do want to put them on usually first thing in the morning before you get out of bed. They work the best if you do it that way. But if you just have light compression socks on, and you get that going early in the morning before you board the plane, they just work the best when you put them on when the legs have already been fairly drained by that horizontal position of sleeping. So even a light compression stocking, like I said, will help a lot. Obviously, you're going to remember to drink water on the plane. It seems counterintuitive, but being hydrated helps you to move fluid, which is very important. And if you use the water salt trick like we were just talking about with the first slide, then you'll find that you actually move fluids around fairly well. You basically have to pump salt across a membrane to move fluids. And so sometimes people have swelling, they tend to avoid both fluids and salt, and that's actually the opposite of what you want to do. The next thing on this list is Urtica urens tincture. Sorry, I didn't put the common name there. That's actually nettles tincture. It is a beautiful green tincture that is full of electrolytes. So basically like salt ions, not as sodium rich, but certainly rich in all the other ions that you need, the electrolytes that you need. And so we often will just dose this before getting on the plane and even on the plane. You can put it in your water as well if you don't mind the taste of that. And that just really does help speed it along. It also tends to improve the clearance of fluids out of the kidney. So you just keep things in circulation. And last but not least, if you do have poor circulation and it's a lot to do with varicose veins, you can get VenaForce gel. So VenaForce is a Dr. Vogel product. It's very common in the health food store. This is not the only brand, but this is the one I really quite like because it's a standardized product, and it's like a gel you put on your legs. You can put it on your legs underneath your compression stockings if you have them, and it's combinations of herbs that really tone up the vein tissue so that they get more efficient at moving blood. So you can actually get that also in a capsule and use it for maintenance for varicose veins. And if you do have the kind of varicose veins that make your feet swell, that's a brilliant idea. Another option is to use the Valeda leg gel. There's a newer, it's probably been around for about 5 years, leg gel, also beautiful consistency, and you can throw that all over your legs. And it works really well for tired legs or legs from that are swollen from travel. Now, jet lag is often a concern for travelers, and jet lag is really caused by, changing time zones. And melatonin is the hormone that sets the 24-hour cycle or circadian rhythm for your body. So with a sleep-wake cycle, the body naturally produces a pulse of melatonin about a half an hour before your normal bedtime. And when we travel, of course, jet lag is going to be partially caused by adjusting to a new day-night cycle. So using a capsule of melatonin at your expected bedtime will help to reset the internal clock and make the adjustment easier. I suggest taking one capsule at the new expected bedtime for about 2 to 3 days in a row, starting on the day of travel. The dose is about 1 to 3 milligrams. Kids at about 1 milligram, adults at about 3 milligrams. Hydration, also important. So making sure that you're eating a little bit and not getting too hungry, because that also stresses out your stress gland, and it makes sleeping difficult when you actually land at your destination. You can add a sleep remedy at your new bedtime if you need to also. We can actually use Compro for this. So this is the same stuff that we used for anxiety on the plane. And it actually just calms you down quite nicely before bed. It's not a sedating remedy, but it does calm down the nervous system. When you've had a long day of stress and travel and you're sleeping in a different bed, that's worth its weight in gold. So you can use that for both. Also, you can use the Neuropass I mentioned earlier. We often use Neuropass to help people sleep, even under, more significant sleeping problem issues. But this can really help if you're already carrying it traveling, to put right at bedtime. Another great idea for jet lag is to really get your feet physically in contact with the earth when you get to where you're going. Just get rid of all the electrostatic charge on your body from being kind of in a plane, insulated from hydration or for like a good humidity. It just helps kind of discharge like an electric shock into the ground. A lot of the time we wear such insulating soles and things like that we can actually build up a fair amount of electrical charge. And we're around all these, wires and electrical devices all day long. And, physically the planet really helps pull all those charges out of us. So, at the risk of looking like Richard Gere in Pretty Woman when he's walking around in the grass outside of his office building, that can really help just discharge some of that for you. Now, the next thing that can affect travelers is getting travel sick. And you can get travel sick in the car, you can get travel sick on trains and planes and boats. And the mechanism for that is the same. Motion sickness is characterized by paleness, dizziness, sweating, sometimes abdominal discomfort, salivating with nausea, and then finally vomiting. So there's really seldom any serious effects from this condition. Especially nowadays, because we obviously don't take, month-long journeys by boat anymore. But if you are prone, you can take homeopathic drops. Now, this shows the drops that I normally use. So we actually combine the top remedies for travel sickness into one remedy so that you don't have to carry more than one set of pellets. But if you already have the pellets at home like this, you can also just take the tubes individually. But this has the 3 top remedies: Cocculus indicus, 30C, Petroleum, 6C, and Tobacum, 6C. So the dose on that is about 10 drops 3 to 4 times per day. You can take it a little bit more often than that, especially if it's on the onset, or if you know that you get travel sick. You can also do this in advance. If you anticipate feeling ill, you can do that. Yeah, but it can also be used on the spot if you didn't realize that you actually get seasick. I've had the experience of this. I actually didn't realize that I could get seasick. I never really had a problem on a boat before. But I did go on a cruise ship once where we actually went through a hurricane in the night. And when I woke up, I actually woke up seasick. And boy, that was not pleasant at all. And unfortunately, I hadn't brought a remedy for seasickness. I hadn't ever experienced that myself. But luckily, it was a retreat, and there were patients of mine on the boat, and lots of them, of course, had it. So they managed to take care of me. The next thing that is really useful for travel sickness is ginger tincture. It's quite effective at 5 to 10 drops every couple of hours. You can also get capsules. They'll just take a little bit longer to work. And I think you can now even get some forms of the drug medication that's usually used for seasickness alongside of ginger, which is quite interesting. But it goes to show you that the data for using ginger for seasickness is actually quite good. Now, the last thing on this list are Sea-Bands. Now, Sea-Bands are a little wristband that stimulates an acupuncture point on the wrist. And that can really help reduce the tendency to motion sickness. And they're super easy to find at a pharmacy. And sometimes if you are traveling, you'll find them in the airport, or you'll find them in the store on a boat for sure. Now, this is often a very big discussion when we talk about traveling, is traveler's diarrhea. Now, good news, bad news on the traveler's diarrhea front. You usually don't pick up diarrhea from an external source when you travel. We all have this idea that, we're getting a diarrhea from something that we're picking up someplace else that's infecting us. And diarrhea obviously can be caused by bacteria. It can be caused by bacterial secretions. It can be caused by parasites and viruses. And in theory, those exposures to different organisms could be had in countries with sanitation differing from the Canadian standard. But don't be fooled. A lot of travelers' diarrhea is totally related to the stress of travel and the effects of that kind of stress on the digestive processes that are normally protective, and what happens to the gut flora or the normal bacteria that create problems in defending the gut barrier when those digestive interruptions take place. A colleague of mine ran a medical lab near an ashram where they had lots of North Americans coming for retreats, and they had a lot of problems with people coming and then having really quite significant gastrointestinal disturbances. And they actually tested, the kitchen staff. They tested people in the town to see if there was something in this town that was infecting people that were coming in. They couldn't find anything, and so they decided to actually take stool samples from people upon arrival. So before they'd really had a chance to settle in and try the food, I guess, they took stool samples and they froze them. And then if somebody got sick, what they would do is they would take a new sample and they would compare it against the sample that they'd taken when that person had arrived. And they found 99% of the time, the person already had the bug that they were suffering from in the original sample. And what they were really experiencing was a huge travel stress that was really destabilizing, the immune system in the guts. And so they weren't really picking anything up at all. It was just that little bugs that normally they were living with just quite peacefully decided to replicate. So this is why we use Crataegus diarrhea prevention tincture. What that actually is a kind of herbal tincture. It's actually hawthorn, and lots of people will know hawthorn for being a cardiovascular tincture, but it does really stabilize the gut wall. And so we use 10 drops before a meal, and that will really work well for protecting you and keeping things quite stable. Now, it's always possible also to pick something up, and I'm not saying that you can't do that. Um, and if bacteria are causal, like whether or not they're your own or ones that you picked up potentially, diarrhea will be a kind of a sudden onset. Sometimes people are worried that it's parasites that are creating that, but if parasites are a cause, onset is usually slower. And you might not even present with a parasitic issue until you're actually home from your travel, because a lot of the time they take a little bit of time, the life cycles take a bit of time to start. Children are most often affected by viral diarrhea. And that's true traveling as well. A lot of the time too with those, you'll see, that they have a little bit of fever and things like that ordinarily you wouldn't otherwise see. Of course, so you're going to take reasonable precautions, to minimize unsanitary exposures. And you want to wash your hands a lot. It's totally necessary after toileting, and it's necessary around the handling of food. But like I said, otherwise you can really, as a general preventative, use Crataegus tincture. Very, very stabilizing. Now, the other thing I have listed here is HMF travel probiotics, and having probiotics on hand is quite useful. They're very stabilizing, and they can replace flora lost if you do get some diarrhea and calm the diarrhea itself. And we use one that's called HMF travel for this. It's very shelf stable, and you can take it with you, and it'll last, outside of refrigeration for a good solid month. At potency. So it means that it would be just as efficient 30 days out of the fridge as it would have been on the first day. Now, there's also a very common treatment, homeopathic, that's for diarrhea that we use out of our office. So this is one we often will send with travelers. And it's a combination of arsenicum, cinchona, and podophyllum. So those are three very common homeopathics for travel diarrhea. And what you can do is take 10 drops of that, basically as needed. So can be if you are feeling quite intense cramping or anything like that, every 15 minutes until it calms down, and then hourly, and then 4 to 6 times a day, and then potentially don't need it at all. Easy to carry, small bottle, can easily put in water and kind of extend it out too if you're running low on it and you've been traveling for a long time. Now, also remember, keep well hydrated during diarrhea. This is another thing that I'm going to push water for. So use the salted water, a pinch per 8 ounces of water. That's about 250 mils. Plus, put a little bit more juice, 1 or 2 ounces of juice on top of that. Orange or some other citrus is often the best choice because of the potassium content. You can also use a little bit of sugar in it. If you can always find a sugar packet traveling. And the reason for that is that you really want to just maintain a little bit of glucose going in the background, especially if the diarrhea is extensive. Hopefully it won't come to that though, because you will put your Crataegus tincture in advance. So let's talk just a little bit about parasites. Like I was saying before, a lot of the time, you're not really going to see a parasitic infection show up until a while after travel. And one of the most efficient treatments for parasites, again, is a simple thing. It's actually salt. This was actually shown, it's like a cheap and easy protocol here that was endorsed by Mexico's chief parasitologist, so that's in their health department, to be superior to their available drugs. And that protocol is to take about a gram of salt. It's about kind of a half teaspoon, alternating with a 1 gram vitamin C for the next 8 hours. So 1 gram salt, then the next hour, 1 gram vitamin C. And to do that, and what it seems to do is just kind of quickly clean up parasites. And we've had this work brilliantly. And it's rare that we've had to do this for more than a couple of days if somebody has picked something up. And acutely, it's easy to source these things. And again, if you had brought your vitamin C for having on the plane, you'll have it with you. And salt's pretty easy to find anywhere. Now, I do think that there are some pretty easy herbal medicines for this. And if you are going to a place where the risk for parasite infection would be higher because you don't have as much control over the water or something like that, we use guava leaf tea. As a general anti-parasitic. It's gentle, it's pretty effective. If there's something bigger in there, like there's a potential for worms, then we actually use an anti-worm tincture with enzymes. So the anti-worm tincture I use is worm seed and pink root. These are pretty strong herbs, so you do have to be careful, and you do have to dose adjust for children. You're going to have to ask us about that because we need to really know the weight of the child and a little bit more about the child. And you can also eat a lot of papaya or papaya enzymes, which are otherwise is known as papain. That will often kill worms, just kind of strips the protective coatings off of them. And if you are successful and you do have worms, you will see the worms show up in the stool. We've had some good success using that. But don't assume that you have worms, like I said, when you're just have just started traveling. It's rarer. You're going to see this really coming later in a trip or after you've gotten back. And not as common as you might think it actually is. Now, overheating. The risk of overheating really can't be overestimated. Many Albertans, at least, already suffer from dehydration-related disorders in our area because of the lack of humidity, and this is only exacerbated by a more intense climate. So it's really important to use rehydration techniques when changing into a hotter climate or on an airplane for an extended period, like we've already talked about. If you're doing a lot of exertion, we have lots of patients that go to do races in various different southern locations, and that can be a real push. Also, during diarrhea or vomiting, where you're losing fluids, you're going to need to be really careful. And as we said before, some jet lag even is due to a person being dehydrated from the flight. So, as before, I really suggest you have some evaporated sea salt on hand. We usually use Celtic. Celtic is the best. It matches the precise profile of blood electrolytes. And dissolve that in your water, a pinch per 8 ounces, and a splash of fruit juice that will just kind of provide some glucose and keep the energy up in a depleting environment. Especially with overheating, people do get a little overwhelmed and they don't really feel like eating, but they still need to keep up the blood sugar. In order to prepare for a hot environment, you can spend some time in a sauna in the weeks leading up to the trip, especially if you're going from the winter cold to like a hot climate for a tropical vacation. This actually tends to work quite well. So 10 to 20 minutes in the sauna a few times a week, it will help acclimatize you to the extra heat. And it doesn't take very long. Usually it's going to be a couple of days. People will really acclimatize mostly to the heat, especially if they can do it gradually. I had one experience once where I was in Portland, Oregon, which normally does not get very hot. And it was 40 degrees centigrade at 100% humidity. And this was really unusual for this area. And we happened to be at a conference in the university area that we were staying in the dorms. The dorms really were not air conditioned, probably because most of the time they would not need that. And it was just brutal. We were all dripping. But I'll tell you, I came back to Calgary, which is normally not 40 degrees by any stretch of the imagination, even in summer. And normally I'm a person who at 25 degrees, I'm sleeping in the basement. I need it cooler. And that year I had got so acclimatized in the 3 or 4 days I was in Portland at that temperature. I was so acclimatized that the rest of the summer seemed kind of cold in Calgary. So you can easily adjust, especially if you already know that you tend to be overwhelmed by heat. Now, there's a couple of other complaints that will come with an excess of sun. Headaches is a really common one. So, an excess of sun or heat. And, they can often be quite severe. And again, we're going to do rehydration for that, but you can also use some homeopathic treatment. We use a mixture of belladonna and a remedy called Glenayam 30C. And You can also have witch hazel distillate. Witch hazel distillate is really easy to find in drugstores. You can usually find witch hazel USP. That stands for United States Pharmacopoeia. It's just a generic, standardized product. It's normally on one of those ones that are labeled kind of generically at the drugstore, and usually the pharmacist can help you find that. And you can just use it with a little spray bottle. It's quite cooling. Now, if you start to get heat exhausted, the symptoms of heat exhaustion are confusion, weakness, dizziness, faintness, becoming uncoordinated, headache, cramps, hyperventilating. Sometimes people feel like the vision changes and there's a rapid pulse. And then eventually people end up with nausea and vomiting. The skin is usually cool and pale and still moist. And so the remedy that we usually use for that is Carbo-Vegetabilis. That's a common homeopathic. Now, of course, you're also going to want to remove the person or remove yourself from the heat, get into the shade, make sure you start pumping fluids in. But this remedy can often help a lot. Fanning the person also under those conditions will help. Now, heat stroke itself is more serious, and it requires medical intervention. This is where a person gets so dehydrated that they're feverish and they're hot and they've stopped sweating. If you see somebody who's kind of gone from headache and then they start to kind of go feverish and hot, you're going to want medical attention. A lot of the time you're going to need IV fluids to rectify that. So this is, again, an argument for maintaining your hydration all the way through your trip, and making sure, especially in a hot climate, that you do that. Now, bugs. So the effect of bug bites can range from obviously being annoying to being a risk factor for insect-borne diseases. In general, we actually use our bug off spray, which is a mix of a number of different essential oils in a sprayable base. And a lot of the time that works exceptionally well. You know, we've had people who just love this bug spray and it really does keep the bugs off of you. But it doesn't smell and it's not poisonous to you. Most bug sprays are poisonous to bugs. That's why we use them. And the one that's historically been used, especially for mosquito prevention, is DEET. DEET is the abbreviation for the chemical that's in that. The unfortunate part of that is that they are neurotoxic sprays. You probably don't want to be using insecticides on yourself for long periods of time. There are some commercial bug sprays now that have picaridin in them. Now, picaridin is actually a synthetic molecule, but it's made to imitate a compound in black pepper essential oil. And it's not toxic, and it has a high efficacy rate. And there's several brands of that's available. I mean, locally we can go to Mountain Equipment Co-op or similar hiking places. I know there's REI in the United States as an example. I'm sure they would have picaridin-based spray, very safe and better efficacy or documented efficacy if you know you're going into particularly bug-rich environment. So bugs all have their own risks, and of course there's different kinds of bugs carrying different things. So let's actually talk about that. Let's talk about that next, because another major question that I will get around travel is what the risks of infectious diseases are in the various countries that somebody's going to. And, you know, if we send somebody on a trip, we check the CDC warnings for that country. So the CDC is the Center for Disease Control. This is an organization in the United States that is responsible for monitoring for the purposes of epidemic control, and also just knowledge base for clinicians and for patients to see if there are issues in various countries with things that are communicable. Now, the CDC site will show you if there's an outbreak of a particular infectious disease in a country, and also give kind of like what the standard prevention strategies are for that. And some of them, of course, there's diseases for which we really have no vaccinations available. And there's just common sense measures, and you should always be taking the common sense measures regardless of what you do for prevention. But do take the CDC warnings with a bit of a grain of salt. It's been our travel experience that there are times where the warnings or the levels of disease are overestimated on the CDC site. A great example of that is that I had an associate doctor who actually worked in South America in a rural environment, and the CDC had this particular location listed as a high malaria site. And locally, they hadn't seen a case of malaria in about a decade at that point. So there are times where that information is not as accurate as we might like it to be. And certainly, I'm also not a big fan of fear mongering about what the relative risks of diseases are, because you have to remember that if you are traveling to a third world country, you're not immediately becoming your own third world conditions. You're well fed, you're well nourished, you've had your own controlled immune exposures, and you probably have a pretty good immune system for the most part. And you're probably not going to go into a location where you're going to be subject to starvation conditions. So, of course, in a lot of these countries, the reasons that you see outbreaks like that is because the general health is not great in those locations. So I think you have to take that into consideration when you're looking at the relative risk. Now, when we go to various countries where we know there's a risk of something, these are some of the top ones that we see people recommended to do vaccinations or prophylactic drugs for. Now, you have to make your own choices around this. If you are really scared of getting a particular illness in this list, consider it. If there is a vaccine for it, you might consider it. Like the hepatitis is a great example of that. People get hepatitis A/B vaccine. There are more forms of hepatitis than that, but those are two common ones. One of those, A, is the major foodborne one, and hepatitis B is a bloodborne one. So that's associated with high-risk behaviors like IV drug use and sexual activity with somebody who's infected with Hep B. So they put them together, unfortunately, though, in the vaccine, so that you're protected against that. But hepatitis is not something where you're exposed to it and you are guaranteed to get a hepatitis either. Remember that you can be exposed to a lot of things and not develop an infection because you can be completely immunocompetent. In fact, in the developing world, it's estimated that when children, as an example, get hepatitis, that hepatitis B in particular, or A in particular, that they clear it 70% of the time without any intervention, and sometimes without anybody knowing that they've had it. So we tend to think of these things as kind of, you get the bug and you have the worst case scenario occur, and that isn't always true. So if you do, though, decide to get a vaccine for hepatitis or any of the other ones that's potentially vaccinatable, then you want to do it way ahead of the time that you're traveling. You don't want to shoot yourself up with vaccines and then get on a plane. I mean, vaccines are quite immune challenging. They require your immune system to actually respond, and you need a certain amount of time for that to develop properly. And ideally, you don't want to do that and then put a travel stress on top of that, because that's quite challenging to the immune system by itself, just the physiological stress. So do it way ahead of time. Find out what the schedules are like, and make sure that you're fitting that in, with a good window prior to you traveling. Now, typhoid is a foodborne salmonella. Salmonella typhi. There's various kinds of salmonella, and there is a vaccine that's about 50% effective. We see about 30 cases of this in Canada per year. We do, like I said, use the diarrhea prevention protocol, and we also can use the homeopathic noso to typhoid. That is not the equivalent of a vaccination, but it is a little bit of a push for your immune system in that very specific direction to defend itself against that organism. Japanese encephalitis is another one that I've heard a lot about. in recent years. Japanese encephalitis is actually a disease of rice farmers. It comes in the summer and fall. And in fact, for most people, it's not particularly symptomatic. But we know if it does occur, it's a brain inflammation. So we get a handful of cases of that probably coming into Canada in a year. There is a vaccine, but nobody actually knows how long that vaccine lasts. And we do have a nosode for that if you're going into a situation where you're going to be in a rural rice farming situation, which is always possible if you're a good backer. Now, the next thing that we often hear a lot about is malaria. Malaria is a mosquito-borne parasite that causes fever and chills. And the fever and chills will be rapid onset fever and chills. And people can actually feel reasonably okay in between the fever and chills period, but they're usually rapid cycling. So it's like you get a fever and then within an hour or two, you're getting chills, and it's very reliable. So malaria can be mild, but it also can be quite severe. And there are prophylactic drugs for malaria. They're a little bit harsh to take. Sometimes they make people feel quite ill. So if you've never taken antimalarials before, you're going to want to experiment a little bit with that ahead of time. Of course, prevention is key. So mosquito bite prevention is key. You want to sleep in a bug net and make sure that the place that you're staying, if the malaria risk is high, it has bug nets. You want to make sure you're using a bug repellent spray. You want to make sure you're using light colored loose clothing with long sleeves. And again, this is just to reduce the risk. And it really depends on the season, what the malarial risk is like, and also the altitude, because mosquitoes have to be able to survive to give it to you. And not all mosquitoes are going to carry this particular parasite, even in an area where malaria tends to be more endemic, because remember, they have to bite somebody who has it and then come and bite you and transfer that from their salivary glands. So the relative risk is you we'll probably see about 150 cases of that in Canada per year. And out of that, like, there might be maybe one death, probably not even one statistically. So it's not as huge of a risk as most people assume. And that's considering, that people are really, there's a lot of worldwide travel with people going back and forth. But you want to be common sense about it, and certainly, you want to take reasonable protective measures. I recommend that if you are going to go in an extended stay in a place that's malaria prone, just have a prescription of drugs that you bought in Canada for malaria with you, just on the odd chance that you start to see symptomatology, because it's easier to treat it quickly when on the onset. But like I said, taking those drugs prophylactically can be awfully hard on a person if you're doing that for months. Now, Zika. Zika has also been talked about a lot in the recent months and year. There's about 500 reported cases of that in the United States. Now, Zika has been around for a long time worldwide. This is not a new infection, but of course, we've seen some correlations with Zika virus and microcephaly in infants, meaning that if a woman contracts Zika during pregnancy, there's a risk for a fetal malformation. Now, the mechanism of this and precisely how it's happening or why it's happening is not clear. So there's been a struggle to figure out what the correlation actually is and why that hasn't been seen in other endemic places where Zika has existed. Like basically it came from Africa originally, I believe, in the 40s, I think, is when they started to notice it. I'm not sure if they named it then or not, but it's been around for a long time. It just kind of basically hopped the pond into South America this year, and that was, of course, the reason why everybody was worried about it when the Olympics were in Brazil. So at the end of the day, we travel, and we talk about entirely, but you can easily get that's high highly parasites out of the water. And we'll take out, and if there's the potential other foodborne disease, to just get a really good builder out there and what easy things that you can do. Resonance remedy or these things. It's not so much to get a hold of us for that. Now, listen to this on your own. If you did register, well, you have a doc has a lays doses and what brand names and some potencies on the homeopathics and how much they are approximately. So that'll come to your inbox in the next day or so. So I hope you learned lots and happy travels.